All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, April 11th of 2022. We're cruising into the start of baseball season here. Got NBA playoffs coming up this week as well, which is pretty exciting. We've got quite a few questions in our queue here for today. We had a few come in via email over the weekend. A couple of you left questions for me in the Office Hours channel in Slack here over the weekend. And there has been some interesting conversation in some of the other channels in Slack this morning that I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about here on stream. Most are baseball related, which is pretty exciting. Makes a lot of sense with the start of that season. We'll talk a little bit about late swap strategies for baseball. We'll talk about exposure settings, especially as it relates to different sized contests and different sized slates. We'll talk a little bit. Actually, we'll talk probably quite a bit about correlation and stacking here in baseball. Quite a few interesting questions about stacking. We've got a couple other questions about showdown strategy, about contest selection, all kinds of stuff here. So a lot of questions to talk about. So super excited about it. If you guys have questions, go ahead and throw them into the YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel in Slack. I'm going to do my best to do these here in chronological order as always, but I will probably kind of mix and match and group a little bit so I can keep us talking about one topic before we move on to the next, because I think these do kind of group themselves out well. Before we get started, before we dive into the first questions, I will be releasing a MLB contest selection video probably in the next 24 hours here out to our YouTube channel. I know that has been very commonly requested. I think somebody even asked specifically for that in the Office Hours channel today. There were a few of you asking for that last week. Will be very similar to what I did for NBA. So we'll talk a little bit about contest selection principles, what our thinking is about the best contest to play and why. And then we'll also go into the lobby then and talk a little bit about what actually the best contests are to play. If you need to fill up, if you have $200 to play, what are the best contests to play? If you have $20 to play, what are the best contests to play? And so on both DraftKings and FanDuel. So look forward to that. I know that was a very popular, I'm going all blurry here. Let's see. Let's autofocus this. See if that helps. Oh, no. That made it worse. There we go. We're back. I know that was a popular video for the NBA season, so hopefully going to have a equally popular one for the baseball season. So anyway, let's get into this. Enough of me chatting here. Let's start answering some questions. So I'm going to start here. Let's see. Two similar questions about correlation There's a few similar questions here about correlation in baseball. So I'm going to start there. I'm going to read a few of these questions here. I'm going to group these together and answer them together. So the first one here is from Neil. So let me go ahead and get all these in first. And we'll read them all at once. We'll kind of answer them all together because I think these are going to be super similar. So this is a combination of a question from Neil and then another question that came in over our email. So the first question says, stacking question. I've been making rules to only allow 5-3, 4-4, or 4-3-1. Am I taking away some of the value of SaberSim by doing this? Without a stacking rule, I would notice a decent amount of 2-2-2 types in my builds, in my pool of 1,500, which doesn't seem optimal. The question we got from email said, how can I force SaberSim to give me more 5 stacks when I don't naturally get them in my builds? Also, I set the exposure of all my 2 stacks to 0, so I'm only getting 3 and 4 stacks. Should I have done that, or is it better to use only 4 or 5 stacks and then let SaberSim pick non-stack players, or to create the 2 stacks after creating the 4 and 5 player stack? So, okay, a lot of questions about stacking, and I even see some more questions about stacking coming in here in YouTube chat right now. So let's talk about this a little bit. So I think this is a double-edged sword a little bit here. There's kind of 2 different opposite forces at play here. So let's start. I want to start first by talking about this from the standpoint of correlation. There's you hear stacking a lot in the baseball DFS space, and stacking is important. But the first principle at play here is really correlation. Baseball is a high correlation sport because when batters get on base, they allow all of the other batters on their team to get closer to their next plate appearance. It stalls the game out. It makes the game longer. Each batter has more opportunities. And there's also some concurrent scoring opportunities, right? Runner gets on base. The next batter comes up, knocks him in, brings him home. Both batters score, right? We can actually, we can just see these correlations, right? These correlations between batters exist. They themselves, between any individual batter, these aren't particularly strong correlations necessarily, right? 0.13, that's a quarter of the equivalent correlation between a quarterback and his number one wide receiver for most quarterback and wide receiver pairings in the NFL, for example, right? But you get a compounding factor because all of these batters are generally pretty well correlated to one another as you stack them together in a lineup. So becomes stacking, right? That is why we stack. Now, traditional optimizers, what people have been using to build DFS lineups for years, really, don't have real correlation values, and they also don't really know how to handle correlation within context, right? We know that we want to correlate our lineups, but just like in football, you're not going to go out and generally make the most hyper-correlated lineup you can. There's a balance between balancing the correlation of players, the raw scoring upside of a player, right? And the ownership and these other factors. And as different variables change, as a contest gets bigger and there's going to be more lineups in there, the probability of a player hitting the stone optimal is going to get higher, right? Or get that the winning score in that contest is going to get closer to the optimal. We may want to value correlation a little bit less in that kind of contest. On a smaller slate, when there are less players in the pool, it's more likely to just build a lineup with extremely high raw scoring upside. We might want a little less correlation there, right? There are other factors at play of basically how much to weight correlation for the context and slate you are playing. And that is why our approach and best practice process, I guess, of what we typically recommend people to do is to not set a stacking rule, to use the default sliders that are appropriate for the contest you are playing, right? The size of the contest and the format of the contest, and that are adjusted for the size of the overall slate. And that will leverage the correlation values we get from our sims at a weighting value that is appropriate based on our backtesting and build you a pool of lineups that we feel is appropriate. Now, this is kind of where the other side of the coin comes into play, right? On step 3, part of the reason why we build 500 lineups, even if you only need 20, is because we know that the builder's maybe not going to always get it. The builder is not going to sequentially build the next best expected value lineup in order from 1 to 20 on the first try. It is easier to feel more confident that you are building your best 20 and entering your best 20 out of your pool of 500 if you build 500 rather than just trying to build 20. So you can get lineups that have 2-2-2 stacks, that have 3-2 stacks, that have stacks that are not as maybe highly correlated at first glance. They're probably going to show up in your pool of 500. They're probably going to show up in your pool of 1,500, however many lineups you're building, right? Let's just take a look at this and see. The reason we have SaberScore and the reason that we have the pool is so that we can take the opportunity to sort these and decide which ones are best. So I don't know if I'm not entirely comfortable saying that a 2-2 stack is optimal, right? Let's go ahead. I want to see some lineups here. So let me adjust some projections. I probably wouldn't play a 2-2 stack, right? I want to see what that lineup looks like. Hold on one sec. There we go. So first of all, actually, let me start here, right? So of this pool of 500, right, when we say the top 20, the best SaberScore lineups in the bunch, most are going to have the stack sizes that you expect, right? 5-3, 5-2, 4-4, 5-4-3, 4-2, right? Generally a pretty good spread, right? And that's because correlation is a factor in SaberScore. When we expand up to the 500 lineups here, we're going to see some of these smaller lineups in the pool. Hang on. Okay. So we can see like lineup 2-2, but that's SaberScore 376. Now, and it's ranked 376. It's SaberScore 69.7, right? The builder's saying there is like it recognizes that this isn't a lineup that is as good as those first SaberScore lineups in the pool. So all of this, I guess, is really to say, and I guess really the point I'm making with this is that this lineup was built with the same correlation weighting factor as the 5-3 lineups that we got in this pool, right? When this lineup was built, the correlations were still valued just as much. So, this lineup probably was built from a set of sims where most of the games were relatively low scoring. And that scoring was so low, something like we saw on Saturday. Scoring was so low that even factoring correlation, the builder couldn't find a lineup that was optimal for this. Now, do you have to play this, or should you play this? I don't know. I probably wouldn't. I would probably still want more correlated lineups. But my point is that you can factor in. It is important to factor in correlation in a way that is dynamic to the slate and dynamic to the contest, and that you should be cautious of raw rules of thumb that exist around correlation, because those rules of thumb came to being to program traditional optimizers to deal with correlation, period, right? And SaberSim deals with correlation in a much more sophisticated way. There was a Twitter thread, I think by Mickles this morning, or maybe not even a Twitter thread, but a review of yesterday's slate. And in the big $18, $15, whatever it is, flagship GPP on DraftKings, 55% of the lineups in that contest have a 5-stack in it. And stacking has become so ubiquitous in MLB DFS that I don't think you're getting any leverage by not stacking. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I don't think we're at the point yet where you're getting an advantage by fading that. But I do feel like in terms of the way people are thinking about correlation and building their lineups, there's probably an over obsession with certain stack sizes. But that's kind of more on the theoretical level. On the practical level, answering both of these questions, making rules to allow only 5-3 or 4-4. First of all, let me ask this. Let me answer this question first, because this is kind of the second side of this. This question says, how can I force SaberSim to give me more 5-stacks when I don't naturally get them in my builds? If you want 5-stacks, if you want to see all 5-stacks in your pool at the end, you can set a stacking rule here in the rules tab of the build settings. So you come over here, rules, stacking, and then you would say at least 5 players from the same team. And that is going to make sure that every single lineup that's built, you're getting 5 players from the same team. Now, back to this question kind of from Neil here of should you do that? I certainly don't think the question really actually reads, am I taking away some of the value of SaberSim by doing this? I don't think this is suboptimal whatsoever. I think at worst, this is potentially unnecessary. SaberSim, as long as you are using the correlation value that is appropriate for your contest and slate, and building a big enough pool, I would say with baseball in particular, actually, I would recommend building a little bit of a bigger pool, mostly because it's not going to take too long. You typically have plenty of time before lock, and there is this lineup construction component here where it makes sense. You're going to see lower SaberScores in your pool in baseball than you would have in NBA, for example. But I don't think it's necessary to set a stacking rule, because using the correlation value that's appropriate for your contest and slate, and then sorting the lineups in step 3 by SaberScore, which also takes into account correlation, is going to give you a set of stacks that you are appropriate regardless. You may see these kinds of stacks showing up in a build, but they're going to show up very rarely, and the SaberScore is going to auto-correct those out pretty much automatically. If you are doing something in your process where you need this pool, I know we've talked about this pool being viable or playable for your contest, and I still agree with that, and I still stand with that. But if you are going to be doing some kind of process where you need this pool to be very specifically viable, that you have an expectation that every lineup in this pool has a certain stack size or something like that, then set the stacking rule. It is by no means going to hurt anything. I think at worst, it is something that maybe is a little bit unnecessary because of the way that we handle correlation. Let me make sure that I answered all the other questions here. The second part of this question from the email said, also, I set the exposure to all 2 stacks to 0-0, so I would just have 3 and 4 player stacks. Should I have done that, or is it better to only use the 4 and 5 stacks and then let SaberSim pick the non-stacked players, or to create the 2 stacks after it creating the 4 and 5 player stacks? Again, I don't think so. What it sounds like here is that this user is going through and removing like the lineups that have minor stacks of like 2. So you're getting rid of like 4 2s. Again, I think at that point, that's probably not adding very much value. I'm perfectly, I think it's pretty, I would almost say there's almost never a slate where I would want to avoid a 4-2 in particular, or a 5-2. I think both of those are fine. A 4-2 on DraftKings is going to have 2 uncorrelated players. A 5-2 is going to have 1 uncorrelated player, 1 one-off. I think that's fine. I wouldn't specifically go out of my way to avoid those in step 3 or to limit those in step 3. I think those are perfectly fine. But anyway, kind of in summary here, and I think there are other questions about correlation. But in summary on these two, before we move on, right? I think the rules of thumb of you need these stacking sizes for baseball have gotten a little bit out of control. And the only reason they exist anyway is because if you're using Fantasy Cruncher or some other tool that doesn't understand correlation, you have to go in and program those rules. You have to say, build this percentage of these lineups and this percentage of these lineups. And because we know these correlations and know how much to weight them, you shouldn't have to do that here. That said, because you're not programming that rule in, you are likely to see at least some proportion of lineups in your pool that aren't the stack sizes you may be used to seeing. But SaberScore will generally auto-correct that out, and those lineups will have lower SaberScores as a result. With that said, if you have an expectation and want to see only a certain type of stacks in your builds, just go in and set the stacking rule. And you can do that here in step 2 into the rules tab by setting this rule here. But I guess the last point there is I would never, for baseball in particular, I would never say that stacking is suboptimal. It's unlikely that that's ever going to hurt you. You're not going to make your lineups worse for wear by setting the stacking rule, but it may, and it probably on most slates, if you're building with a big enough pool, it's probably an unnecessary step. So anyway, good first question here. Let's go ahead and keep it going here. I do see some questions in YouTube starting to trickle in now. So welcome, everybody. Happy Monday. I have a lot of questions in our queue here that came in over the weekend. So we're going to be pretty busy through the first part of the stream, catching up on the questions that are in the Slack channel, but I promise we will get to the YouTube chat questions before the end of the show today. So going to keep going for now. Ron asks a good question here. And he says, when running late swap in MLB, sometimes I get really low SaberScores into 60s and 70s. Is this bad? Should I be going back and fixing exposures to try to get some better SaberScores, or is this something I shouldn't be worried about? So this is a really good question. I would recommend when you are late swapping for baseball, I would highly recommend for now leaning pretty heavily on either quick swap or actually probably even better, leaning heavily on late swap, but turning this toggle on that says only swap lineups containing out players. And what this is going to do, it's pretty straightforward. This is going to take your set of lineups, right? But it's only going to rebuild. It's only going to rebuild the lineups where you have a player that has a 0 projection or isn't in the lineup. And the reason why I would recommend doing that is because the other news that's going to be breaking, slightly different lineups than expected, the variety of different things that can come up aren't going to affect projections so much that I would want to throw away all the lineups I built before and rebuild everything from scratch. I think the most important thing with late swapping for baseball is just making sure you don't have that 0 in your lineup and rebuilding in full those lineups that do have a player with a 0 so that you still get a very correlated lineup out of that. The reason you are getting low SaberScores when you are rebuilding every lineup in your late swap is the same reason that there are lineups with low SaberScores in your initial pool, right? Since baseball is a little bit more of a complicated sport on the lineup construction side of things. You can build lineups that have a SaberScore of 60 SaberScore in your pool of 500 because there are sets of simulations where even factoring in correlation, even factoring in correlation leads to a lineup that isn't very well correlated or something like that, right? So I would avoid situations where you are late swapping every single lineup you made in baseball for now. If you are going to do that, like if a lineup comes out and it's a little bit different than expected and you have no players that are out, but you still want to late swap things, I would try to do more in front of it to better prepare the builder to make better lineups, because it's not going to get the chance to build a lineup pool and sort through them and hand you the highest SaberScore. Every lineup's only going to get rebuilt once. So if you're going to rebuild every lineup that you are late swapping, I would then consider maybe setting some stacking rules to give the builder some guidelines, some rules to work within as it's building lineups. And I think you'll get a better result out of that. But again, for me, what I've been doing to this point in the season is I am only swapping if I have a player that's out. And the easiest way to do that is to just check, right? I don't have any, these are all empty lineups. I don't have any players in here, but you can pretty easily, once all the lineups are confirmed, just check and like, oh, I have a player that's marked out, has a 0 projection. I'm going to late swap and I'm going to turn this checkbox on. And that just limits the amount of lineups that get changed as a result of that late swap. And I think that's probably my overall best practice here with late swapping, to avoid that situation where you're getting those lower SaberScore lineups. And those lower SaberScore lineups would have been in your pool anyway. They're not bad, right? They're probably just not maximizing the potential expected value you could have gotten out of them. I would be very confident in saying that they are probably still positive EV in your lineup, in your contests. They're just not perfectly optimal, or they're not as close to optimal as they could be with maybe the help of a little extra support with maybe a stacking rule or something like that. So good question there. Okay. This is a question from Dr. Toy. This came in from Saturday, about exposures. And he says, can you set different global max exposures to pitchers and hitters? I know the step 2 exposure, but it looks like it affects everyone. Like if I only want 30 to 40% on hitters, but I don't mind going 60% on pitchers. You can't. But what I would do is just take whatever the bigger value between those two is and set it as the maximum exposure, and then adjust the hitters down from there in step 3. It will save you a little bit of time. So, for example, let's say that you are building for a 20 max. Let's use this example exactly. Let's say your hitter cap is 40% max exposure and your pitcher cap is 60% max exposure. I would just set the max exposure in step 2 to 60. And for those of you that aren't aware what this does, this is a global maximum exposure that applies to your entire pool of lineups and to the 20 that you're actually building. And it applies consistently to every player in the pool. So it's not something that I would say I use all too often, but it is very useful if you do know that you don't want any more than a certain exposure cap to any one player right off the bat. It will help build you a little bit more of a balanced pool here. We'll let this build. This build can take a tad longer just because it has that limitation on every player in the pool, but we'll let this build and then I'll show you how then I would cap down for the hitters in particular. So. Give me a good opportunity to catch my breath here. Dan said right off the bat, nice pun there. I didn't even realize. I say that all the time. That's a pretty common expression for me. But I suppose it is a pun. All right, cool. Our build's done here. And we should see here in just a moment, after the build has a minute to load itself up, that we are capped at 60% for all players. And what really this will ultimately do is just make it so that you're kind of closer to your final exposures that you want after you go in and edit. So I would go in and cap your hitting exposures here to 40%. And you'll also have a much more diverse pool here as well. Like it will be easier for the builder to find these exposures because they're capped at maximum 60 in your entire pool of 500 anyway. So and there you have it. So something like that should do the trick. Cool. Okay, good question from Marcus here. And this is about NBA, but I'm going to answer it from the standpoint of both baseball and basketball here. But he said, question for tomorrow's stream, when is the best time to use quick swap versus the best time to use late swap? For example, let's say it's a 10-game slate starting at 7 p.m. LeBron James has been ruled out at 10:30, being the last game of the night, and Luka was ruled out at 7:30 after LeBron news has been made. So I would say best practice for basketball, right? is if anytime a player gets ruled out, you probably should just do a quick swap quickly, just because it's very easy to do it. It literally takes, it takes seconds to do it. Get that player out of your lineup, replace them with somebody that at least is playing basketball that night, upload that file, and then always do a late swap, right? Because a player getting ruled out in basketball typically opens up so much additional minutes and usage for that team that it often changes the whole context of the slate. And if Luka's out or LeBron's out or both are out, that's going to open up a ton of value on those teams. So you want to fully rebuild all of your lineups in that case to take advantage of that news. If you are comfortable with it and feel like you have enough time, you could probably skip the quick swap step. The quick swap step is mostly just to make sure you don't get screwed, which has happened to me before. So don't sleep on the likelihood of that happening. Player gets ruled out, you go to your computer, you're like, oh, I can't wait to update this and take advantage of late swap, and then your internet goes down for 2 minutes and you don't get those swaps in time. Quick swap is like that. It is so fast that you might as well do it. But you should always follow that up with a late swap in basketball. I would say it is typically going to open up enough value or change the slate enough that it is worth doing. In baseball, I think you're probably fine just doing quick swap if you have a player that's out, right? On average, I think that's going to be perfectly fine. The worst case scenario there is that you will have had a player that was out, or you would have had a player in your lineup that was in a stack that has now been ruled out. And your 5 stack in that lineup may become a 4 stack. Your 4 stack may become a 3 stack, and so on. I don't think that has a huge negative impact on that lineup overall. So I think you could probably just be fine with quick swap. I think what my favorite way of late swapping for baseball, at least to start the season so far, what I'm doing is I'm just doing kind of the combination of the two, which is the late swap, but only for lineups that have out players. And this is going to take that lineup that has a player that's out. Maybe Bryce Harper gets scratched, right? All of a sudden you have to rebuild your Philly stacks, right? This will allow you to do this. It'll take the lineups where the player's out, but rebuild them fully, keeping track of correlation and things like that, and build you kind of a newly correlated and stacked lineup. So that's probably best practice for baseball. But since this was an NBA question, best practice for NBA is to make sure best practice for NBA is to get a full late swap in each time there is news, right? Now, it probably is responsible to run a quick swap first so you don't get screwed with a player that's out sitting in your lineups because the late swap took too long, but you should always be late swapping first. So I don't think there is any situation in basketball where I see some news break and I'm like, oh, that's quick swap news, or oh, that's late swap news, right? It's pretty much always you probably want to late swap if you're going to be swapping at all. So. Okay, brings us to a showdown question for baseball from Dan, and I actually think there were 2 of these that were very similar. So first of all, question says, is there a simple way to limit the amount of one position that is in my lineups? I ran a few builds for New York and Boston and got slammed with 2 relief pitchers in a few, and 2 relief pitchers and a starting pitcher in at least another one. I'd like to set a build rule to have no more than 1 starting pitcher or relief pitcher, but it seems like I need to select all possible options, all relief pitchers and starting pitchers in step 2. So the rule that you want is no more than 1. So less than 2. So I think what you have kind of discovered here is what you need to do. You will need to set that rule. So let's see. So you would go in here, step 2, groups, and then probably, so you can grab, so I know it's a little tedious, but you can grab all the pitchers at once if you just pick the first one and then scroll all the way down to RP. Like it's a lot of names, but then if you shift click, that will kind of select everybody in between there. And that's probably the easiest. Like, it's a ton of names here. From there, you can just do less than 2, right? Which would allow 1 pitcher. If you wanted to do this for only the relievers, right? So you wanted to allow both starting pitchers and up to 1 reliever. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But that's the easiest way to do that. So yeah, Dan says shift click, you're the best. Yeah. It was actually, somebody taught me that on stream. So I thought you had to go in and click them, but the shift click, that should save you a lot of time. I will say, I don't like these sliders. This is like probably the first time I've ever said this on stream before. We are planning on probably changing these. But for MLB Showdown, mostly the ownership fade slider feels way too high for me at the moment. We're going to take a look at the MLB Showdown sliders to see, what we want to do there. I personally think this is my favorite set of MLB Showdown sliders for now. And all this is going to do is it's going to take a single game simulation and give you the optimal, and a single game simulation and give you the optimal, and so on until all the lineups are done. I don't know. I'm not confident saying that this is best. Like, I don't think you need necessarily that level of granularity to beat Baseball Showdown. But I believe that the ownership fade slider is too high in particular. And because of how low the ownership numbers are for relief pitchers, that it's emphasizing them more and more in your lineups. So I would probably, to save you the time, I would start building on 0-0-10 for MLB Showdown and see what those lineups look like, and see how they look in particular with relief pitchers and pitchers in general, and see if you're a little more happy with that. And then if you decide you still need to go in and make a rule, then you can do that. But I personally, I think that the sliders are a little inflated for Baseball Showdown, especially the ownership fade slider, which is causing some of that. So, okay, Joe, interesting question here, and potentially maybe a disappointing answer here, depending on the way you slice this. But he said, "What are some strategies for short slate, 4 or less games MLB?" And my strategy overall, it does not dramatically change in the way that I'm approaching smaller slates versus larger slates. Beyond what is implied in the what's going on here? It looks like Cleveland's going off. That's not a very good start for Mr. Carlos Hernandez. Anyway, my overall strategy in terms of the steps I take, I guess let me put it this way. My process does not change dramatically based on the size of the slate. I do kind of similar things. Strategically, right? The bigger impact between like the smaller slate and the larger slate is that your like the variance and the ownership fade slider come up, right? You are probably willing to accept a wider range of outcomes and more aggressively fading the chalk, right? The edge you are getting from ownership in particular is probably going to be a little bit more pronounced in a smaller slate, just because there's less overall plays on the slate, right? The chalkiest pitchers are just going to be the pitchers on the slate that happen to project a little bit better, right? It is not as if they are just that much more of an elite play. Like, think about how well a player would have to be projected to be 50% owned on a 12-game NBA slate, or a baseball slate, sorry, right? They would have to be spectacularly well projected. Their failure condition would probably be a lot lower than Aaron Savale, who is just kind of happens to be projected for 50% owned on this 3-game slate because there's so few pitchers available. It's not like this is a very good play, right? So I'm a little bit more, I would say this, like broad strokes, process is the same, but I am willing to fade ownership a little more heavily. I am willing to take bigger stands, partly out of necessity. When there are less players on the slate, it's harder to be really spread out on your exposures. So I'm willing to be a little bit more exposed to players on smaller slates. And also, typically, I would say I'm a little less invested into smaller slates. I think the variance is going to be a little bit higher. It's a lot easier to totally brick a 3-game MLB slate than it is to brick a 12-game MLB slate. So I am willing to be a little bit more conservative with my bankroll on these kinds of slates as well. But otherwise, other process steps are similar. And I think that's a good thing. I think if your process, if the actual steps you are taking to go through and build your lineups are dramatically different for a small slate versus a large slate, I'd look into that. And I'd ask yourself, why are they different? And does one, going back to my baseball stream that I did for opening day, does one give the equivalent value compared to the other for much less effort? So, good question, though. Yeah, these emojis are so funny. This is how it looks for me on my end. Chill W dog, chill W dog A. I know. I don't know if HC's here today. I think he is. Yeah. With the dabs, it comes up as elbow cough for me, which I find endlessly hilarious. But anyway, let's get to the next question. Okay. So GA and Sir Dudley both asked about contest selection. Since we have a busy stream here today, I'm going to skip these questions and let you guys know again, if you missed it from the start of the stream, I'm going to be releasing a video specifically on this subject in the next 24 hours, either this afternoon or first thing tomorrow morning. And it will go into more detail than I can do on the stream here today. Baseball is a little tricky. The principles are still the same, but the contests that are out there aren't great. I think it's a little bit hard to parse, even if you're familiar with our recommendations of playing a unique lineup wherever you can, playing under $3 wherever you can, focusing on effective entrance, that kind of thing. It's easy to still not really know what to do. And I felt the same way when the first contest got posted, just because frankly, the contests are worse. And it's harder to know what to do. So I'll be putting out a video for that in the next 24 hours, and we'll go from there. So wanted to touch on this question from John. This let's see actually here. Yeah, let's hit these real quick. So this is from John. And he said, I'm new to SaberSim and had a question while building lineups. Why does it concentrate on two teams so heavily and usually from the same game? So good question. The first, why are players from the same team so often used? So that is because of the correlation of these players, right? So because every single time Marcus Semien gets on bat or on base, fails to get out, right? He provides more opportunities for the other players on his team to also get a plate appearance, right? You have to get 3 outs every inning for 9 innings for the game to end. And if you are not getting outs, the game gets longer and longer and longer, and players get more opportunities to score. So it creates a correlative effect amongst players on the field where, as one batter gets a hit, the others have more opportunity. There is also another factor of correlation here where, if 1, 2, 3 hitters all get on base and a 4 hitter comes in and hits a grand slam, everybody scores. They scored to get on base. They score to get the runs. The cleanup hitter gets a ton of points. That's also a correlative factor. So it's generally to your advantage to play players from the same team together. And that happens automatically when you build with SaberSim because of our correlation slider, right? We know how correlated players are because of our simulations. These numbers are coefficients of correlation based on our sims. And then we leverage that information when we build your lineups. Why are you getting game stacks is actually a lot more of an interesting question. The first is that there's a pure luck element there, especially on a slate where there's only 6 teams and there's only 3 games. The likelihood that if you have a Rocky stack, that the paired other stack is a Ranger stack is just higher than it would be for a larger slate because there's just fewer games available on this slate, right? If there were, if it was a 5-game slate and you had a Rocky stack on one of them, there would be a 1 out of 9 chance that the other team in theory was from the same game. Here, there's a 1 out of 5 chance that the other team is from the Rangers. So the smaller the slate is, the more likely you're to get some game stacks. But on a probably more interesting level than that, there are some factors that don't necessarily create positive correlation on average between 2 teams, right? Like that don't create a situation where maybe that the Rockies are more likely to score just because Texas is scoring. But there are some shared factors. I guess what I'm trying to say, there are some shared factors that can overall increase the likelihood of a game being a good scoring environment. And those are probably mostly park factors and weather factors. If there is a park that lends itself well to hitting, you are more likely to get game stacks of that game, even though there are not positive correlations between the 2 teams. Both teams are benefiting from playing in the friendly hitting park, right? They're both going to be projected better. Similar with weather, right? Especially as we get into the summer and we get those really hot, dry games, maybe some games where wind is blowing out. That's going to benefit both teams, right? Those 2 teams are generally pretty independent from one another from an actual statistical correlation, but they're both benefiting. They're both going to be higher projected, so you'll get some game stacks. But broadly speaking, the most important lineup construction factors here are just the correlations between players on one team. And that's definitely something that you would want to specifically target and emphasize in your lineup construction if you were building with any tool. Game stacks in baseball is just something that I completely ignore. I don't force them and I don't avoid them. They are beyond what is implied in the projections or the simulations themselves. They are basically irrelevant. So, cool. Good question. And then there was another question. This was from JB Shuck. Is that how you pronounce it? This was your question. I know you're watching here. I saw you pop up earlier. But this was a question from the baseball channel earlier today. I just thought it'd be a good opportunity to mention this. Said, just a question, as this is my very first MLB season with SaberSim. I know it's been said in NBA, making no adjustments lines are still very viable. It appears to me, please help me understand or correct me, but making adjustments in MLB is almost a must by at minimum expanding your player pool. I don't know if I agree that it is a must to make adjustments. I also don't know if I agree with expanding your player pool. I mean, I don't adjust my player pool whatsoever. I never contract my player pool. So in step one, I'm never removing players from my pool. And in fact, because projections are so close in baseball, I would recommend you don't. I would probably recommend leave every player and stack in your player pool when you're building in step one on SaberSim. If you are talking more about diversifying, right? If you are mean more like it seems necessary to diversify in step three, right? I think that's a great way to add value. And I think you'll be pretty naturally diversified because your sim variance slider is often going to be so high. But if you are looking at your exposures in step three and they feel too risky, right? They feel too undiversified, then absolutely take the steps to diversify further by adjusting your maximum exposures down. So if that's kind of what you mean by expanding your player pool, by actually capping your max exposure in step three, I think that's a great idea. That's something that you're only going to be able to answer for yourself. That's not something that I could just hand to you and say, this is the right amount of exposure to have to any one hitter or pitcher for this size slate. That's the builder is going to kind of try to approximate that based on the contest and the slate, but you have to ultimately kind of fine tune that. I will say this, in NBA, it is going to be much harder to brick, right? You are the best plays on the slate are generally going to be well enough projected. They're going to have a relatively normal distribution where their most common outcomes are around their mean projection. And even if you do not bank or win, you are likely to do okay. You are going to have brick days and slates, like full on 0 days in baseball. And that does not mean you did anything wrong, right? So if you are judging your performance on a slate to slate basis based on how much money you win back, you're going to have a bad time with baseball, at least mentally speaking. That's honestly a habit that should be broken anyway, right? Measuring your DFS success of what was working and failing in your process based on how well it does on a given day is already a bad idea because all games are high variance enough. But in NBA, you can kind of cover that up just because the odds are that you aren't going to have terrible performing days. In baseball, you are, right? You may have, this is a perfect example, right? Maybe you're overexposed to Milwaukee stacks on today's slate, and maybe this is optimal based on all of the context of this slate. Now, all it takes is, Yelich and Wong and some of these guys to just have a terrible day, and it's over. Like, you're shot. And funny enough, that's his most common outcome, right? This is generally true of most batters. So I guess all of this is to say here, I think adjusting exposures down to manage this risk is a great idea. You will often see that, like most of the time, what SaberSim is going to do is going to diversify you appropriately in one spot or the other. So in this particular case, the pitching is pretty bad on this little 3-game early slate. These pitchers are not very well projected altogether. So you're relatively more spread out on pitchers, and it's condensing you more on the batting side, right? Onto Brewer stacks, which is actually pretty standard with SaberSim. You'll find either your pitchers or your stacks are a little bit more spread out, but it's perfectly fine to say that's far too much exposure that I'm comfortable with. And capping exposure, especially to hitters, I think is a great idea as a way to diversify. And you can diversify this way, which will give you a little bit more of a spread outcome and allow you some opportunities to win back some of your equity on a slate-to-slate basis. This is also, going to be a little bit bankroll dependent. If you're playing 5% of your bankroll per night, like our kind of recommended max, you may want to invest a little time into not trimming your pool, spreading out your exposures a little bit more so you're not at so much risk of just like a complete brick. If you're playing 1% of your bankroll and want to play pretty aggressively and play pretty tightly with your exposures, I think that's totally fine. But Lartar said, doubled my entry amount on opening day and lost it the next slate. That is such as the way of MLB DFS. Yeah, it really is. It's a higher variance game in that regard. So, but cool. Good question. Okay. So, question from Samuel. This was also in the MLB channel in Slack. And I just wanted to answer this because I think it's every time I see this question, I want to take an opportunity to answer it. So the question said, under step 3, is rank or unique better for the entry editor? Thanks, fellas. Let's get them. I think I said money bag, so it's the emoji there. So let's get that money. Anyway, so is rank or unique fill better? Neither is better. That's actually kind of an important thing to just note in general. There's no fill method in the entry editor that is better than the others that we can say, for all situations, use this one. They're for different purposes. And I would say if you're asking this question or if you're unsure, you should probably be using a unique fill method. The unique fill method is basically going to allow a little bit of additional variance into your process in terms of what contest does a lineup go into, but it's going to smooth out your variance and swings over the long run by giving you as many lineups in play as possible, right? So I could certainly end up in a situation where tonight a lineup ends up in the quarter jukebox that if it ended up in the $4 would have been a $7,500 bank, and it ended up in the quarter jukebox by pure randomness. Because of how variant baseball is to begin with, I am willing to live with that, and I'm filling these all with unique fill. I'm going to play 73 unique lineups tonight. This is my contest selection list for tonight's slate, right? And I know that it sucks when you bank the quarter and you know that it could have gotten in the four-seamer by pure luck. But with how variant the game is already, I want to be as spread out as possible, and I'm willing to accept that just because I want to give myself as many opportunities at having that winning lineup as possible. I don't think there's anything wrong with rank fill either. If you are rank filling, you are just doubling down on those lineups, that top 20 or top whatever, and you are doubling down. I think there's also, you can kind of do an in-between rank and unique fill, which I think is an interesting idea where you would I like to sort by entries. And then what you can do is you can basically build, let's see, so 3, 6, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So you could build 33 lineups total and rank fill your multi-entry stuff and unique fill your single entry and 3 maxes. So in that case, I would build 33 lineups. I would fill the top 20 all from this, and then put an additional 13 unique lineups into each of my single entries and 3 maxes. I think that's actually kind of an interesting in-between. I may end up floating around and messing with some of that a little bit here or there, but I am, at least to start the season, as I'm kind of getting my feet wet and getting refamiliarized with the sport, I'm just putting a unique lineup into every contest I'm playing, and I would recommend you do the same. And be prepared, right? The odds are, like, I'm playing 73 entries and the four-seamer represents only 20 of them, right? The odds that my best overall lineup is in that contest is like less than a 1 in 3 chance, right? Almost a 1 in 4 chance. So the odds aren't very good of that. And you should be prepared for that going in, right? You should understand that the likelihood of everything lining up perfectly isn't very high. But remember, and if you can mentally position it in your head, right? Remember, try to think about it as if you hadn't unique filled, you wouldn't have had that lineup anyway, right? So if you end up, if you win the quarter jukebox or something like that, and it could have been in a higher dollar contest, don't get upset about that. Remember that the alternative wasn't it being in the four-seamer. The alternative was probably not having that lineup at all. And that way, I think, is a little bit of a healthier way to think about it, where you're not tilting contest assignments of certain entries. So but again, one is not better than the other. They are different strategies. I would say if you are unsure of what to do for baseball in particular, at least, put a unique lineup into every contest. So, okay. Good question here from Joe. He said, if you were playing a bunch of single entry and 3 maxes, 10 plus in MLB, would you cap position player exposure like you would for an MME set? The fewer number of lineups that you have to mess around with, the harder it is to be very specific and discrete with your player exposures, right? Like if you only have 3 lineups, for example, you only have 4 discrete exposures you can even use, right? You can have a player 0, 33, 66, or 100% exposed, right? So one challenge of playing less lineups in terms as it relates to exposure is that. The other is that, those exposures mean different things. If you're playing 10 lineups, 10% exposure is 1 lineup. If you're playing 150, 10% exposure is 15 lineups. So all of this to say, yes, or no, specifically is the way this question is written. If the fewer lineups I'm playing, the less stringent I am about exposure. The more comfortable I am kind of letting the exposures fall where they do after running the build, the more comfortable I am having more exposure to a player. Just because, like, taking a player from 100% to 20% exposure if you're playing 10 lineups is only a difference of 8 lineups. And yes, you are still changing that exposure. It just has a different meaning. It has a different impact in terms of what you've invested into those. So I would say for me in particular, a lot of the rules of thumb that I've described in here today and also some of the other videos on our YouTube channel, I would say they are generally set and they generally apply assuming you are playing at least 20 unique lineups. If you were playing less than 20 unique lineups, or if I was playing less than 20 unique lineups, I would probably be just like far more flexible in general with the way that I approach exposures, just because you have less lineups to work with. So, Edward had asked a question about relief pitchers. Edward, I don't know if you caught the last segment. He said, tried playing showdowns in MLB this weekend. What's the best way to limit exposures to relief pitchers? I tried filtering by fantasy points in step 1, and that was the best way I could figure it out. Is there another way? That's a great way to do it. As a starting point, to just set that the minimum. I think the maximum of relief pitcher is going to be projected for is like 3 points max. So if you just set your player filter exposure to 3, I think that's one way to just probably pretty broadly remove all of them pretty quickly. I think what I would probably do instead, though, and again, I'm not sure if you caught this already, I would adjust your sliders to 0-0-10 for now. I think people are getting more relief pitchers than makes sense because the ownership fade slider is kind of high at the moment for MLB Showdown, and it's causing very low projected owned relief pitchers to get overused in lineups. And by basically just creating single game simulation optimals, you may still get relief pitchers in your showdown lineups, but you will only get them at the rate at which they are optimal in the sims. And then at that point, like that's great. That's exactly what you're hoping for at that point. So I think that's what I would start with. Start building at 0-0-10 for your MLB showdowns and see how you like those lineups. If you still don't want those, if you're still getting relief pitchers and you don't want them, yeah, I would set this at like 3, and that will take care of that pretty quick. 3 seems to be like pretty consistently kind of a hard cap of when relievers get thrown into lineups. But I wouldn't do this one first, just because relievers can actually still give you a pretty good edge in Baseball Showdown, and I would want to leave them in my pool, but just use them at the rate at which they're optimal, and that's what 0-0-10 does. So do that first. Start there. And we are planning on taking a look at these sliders. I've brought it up to the team already. I personally I rarely say this. If you've watched this stream every single day since it began, I've probably said this like only a couple times. I don't like the default sliders as they are for Baseball Showdown right this moment. I would use 0-0-10. So, okay, I'm going to hit this. This is a follow-up from Edward. Okay, actually, let me hit this first. CG Can you explain 0-0-10 more? Yeah, I'd be happy to. So, and this is important. This is a really important concept, which is why I just grabbed this question as soon as I saw it. So, what the sim variant slider is, right? This slider determines how big of a bucket of simulations you're looking at for each individual lineup, right? So we have approximately 10,000 simulations of this game, right? Every player's projection is their mean average projection across all of those sims. These team totals, 5.1 and 4.9, are averages across all of those sims, right? But when you pull up a player, you can actually see, for example, for Austin Meadows, this is his full range of actual outcomes in the simulations here. The sim variant slider across the board for all sports at SaberSim basically determines how many sims do we want to look at when we build each individual lineup. So at 0, it would be the average projection. It would be every simulation we had. At 10, it's a single game simulation. So basically, a 0-0-10 build is taking a single simulation of this game, and based on what the fantasy points were scored by players in that single simulation, building the optimal lineup you can, right? And it'll do that 500 times. And then on step 3, it'll float the top 20 to the top. So every lineup, when you do this kind of build, is literally an optimal from a sim, which is essentially what you're trying to do in showdowns, right? Is basically build optimals. For baseball, I don't know if that's as much the case, but I think it's a really good approximation of what you're trying to do. The reason why I don't like these defaults, and probably even less so, I think the correlation slider is fine, right? But what these sliders do, what the correlation and ownership fade sliders do, is they essentially act as multipliers on the projections scored in the sim that are used when building the lineup. So instead of using a single game simulation and just optimizing for those set of projections, it is adjusting what those players scored in that set of simulations based on how low owned they are and how much they correlate to the other players in the lineup. And I think this one in particular, for the context of MLB Showdown, is the troublemaker, because it is multiplying the output of what those players scored in the sims by like extremely low ownership projections, sometimes 0% ownership projections. And that's creating a situation where where you're over pumping up those relief pitchers. So, but 0-0-10, you'll hear me talk about 0-0-10 all the time if you watch this stream. And it is always, for all sports, it is a single sim optimal of the slate. It is basically one simulation of the entire slate and the optimal lineup from that sim. And there's a lot of interesting things you can do with that. So, okay, so I wanted to hit this follow-up here, kind of an MLB Showdown. I would agree that if you were resetting your build settings, it would take ownership to 0. But why wouldn't you want to set the correlation slider lower than 4? It seems like you would not want the builder to totally ignore correlation. What are your thoughts? So the idea is ultimately that there are so many players in the baseball pool with such wide ranges of outcomes that you probably don't need a true stone optimal here to win MLB Showdown. We can basically take advantage of the correlation as a tool to increase our percent chance of having a high scoring outcome on our lineup. But since we don't need like the stone optimal for most smaller field MLB Showdown contests because of how many players are in the pool and how hard it is to get that optimal, right? Like if your lineup is at the last second kind of comparing between using, I'm looking for two guys that are kind of similarly projected, Robbie Grossman or Bobby Dalbec, right? Who are projected for both pretty similar. And they both in that, like, let's say in one sim, Dalbec or Grossman scored 8 and the other Dalbec scored 7.9, right? But the rest of your lineup mostly has a Boston stack built around it. Adding a little correlation in there will help the builder choose Dalbec, knowing that in the sim, the optimal was Grossman. Because both of those two players are roughly equivalent, you don't probably need the stone optimal, and you maybe should choose the player that scores a little bit more every single time. Or not every single time, more often, right? That's essentially why the correlation slider is on. It is because it's hard for the size of these contests for people to actually get the optimals in Baseball Showdown, so you can use correlation to get a little bit of a higher scoring outcome. But I don't mind turning that off. I understand it either way. So, Matt, I see your question in Slack here about finding the top ways to go about finding my leverage. Let me start here. On our YouTube channel, there is a video. Actually, it's going to be kind of hidden now. 150. Let me just try to search here. Okay. So if you search, it's kind of hidden because it's from last year. If you search 150 lineups, I did this video last year, and this was literally my process to build 150 for last year's July 30th MLB slate. This is a little out of date. I do things a little bit differently now, but I would find some time to watch this because a lot of what I do is still similar, or at least the way I think about baseball DFS is still very similar to this. This is a really big question. I spent an hour talking about it last year. So I will wrap back around to this, at least for a quick discussion on this. But I would watch that video, and for now I'm going to jump to some of these other questions that are in YouTube chat that are a little bit more bite-sized, because I think that's a little bit of a big question to talk about. So anyway, I want to hit these questions in YouTube chat here. So I appreciate your guys' patience if you've been waiting. T said, is it better to let the builder build each stack type separately or all at once? If the builder is focusing on 5-3 stacks, will it perform better since it is focusing on only those stacks? Thanks. That's a kind of nuanced question. That's kind of interesting. If you set, okay. If you were to build a build of 500 lineups with no stacking rules set, and then on step 3, set your minimum exposure to 5-3 stacks to 100% and say, I only want 100% 5-3 stacks, I would argue that method is probably worse than just having set the 5-3 stacking rules in the rules tab. Because by setting a stacking rule, you are building a pool of 500 where every lineup is the construction you want right from the gate, right out of the gate, and then you're sorting the best 20 of that there. You have more opportunities. In the first example, where you don't set the stacking rule at all, you have all of these lineups that get immediately thrown out that are 5-2s, 4-3s, 4-4s, etc. Right? So now that is not to say that it is better to set the stacking rule, because I don't think it is by definition true that a 5-3 stack is always better than a 4-3. You might have a 4-3 that is a better overall lineup than the 5-3. But if you want just 5-3 stacks, you will get a better set of lineups optimized for what you are trying to do by setting that stacking rule ahead of time, because you will have a pool of lineups in step 3 that is more appropriate to what you're trying to do. You will avoid a situation where you're throwing out a bunch of lineups that just don't have the right stacking type all at once. So the simple answer is, if you know what stacking types you want before the build, tell us so we can build you a better pool. But I do not think that is necessarily something you have to do, because the other alternative stack types that you get in step 3 are often just as good. So and then T had said, is it better to run a build for each stack? Does SaberSim work better when it's focusing on? Okay, so I would not do that. I would not do like, this is my 5-3 build stack, this is my 5-2 build stack, this is my 4-3 build stack, and then try to figure out what exposure you want. If you are comfortable, if you are willing to get a varying type of stack types, I would just build with default settings with no stacking rule and adjust your exposures in step 3, because that's what it was designed to do, right? So you could come over here, and assuming that you're comfortable with some level of flexibility in your stacks, right? I realize I'm kind of just kind of talking here without demoing any of this, so I feel like I should take an opportunity and show some of this here. But, right, if you are comfortable with flexibility, edit your exposures. It's perfectly fine to say, well, I wanted a little bit more 5-3s, but I don't want only 5-3s, and do something like this. That's fine. That's a big part of the reason why SaberSim is designed the way it is, to allow you to do stuff like that. So totally fine to do that. But don't break your stack types into different builds purely to differentiate your stack exposure, because that's going to take so much time. That's not going to be worth it for you. So Brad says, also, instead of setting rules ahead, I build my lines, then go in and where it identifies the stack and remove the stacks I don't want. Is that the wrong approach? No, that's totally fine too. That's totally fine. So if you got here, and you said, yeah, you know what, for one reason or another, I don't want 4-3s. I think 4-3s are a pretty good stack type, but maybe you don't want them. You can come in here and do that here. So no worries there. That's the way it's designed to do, or that's what it's designed to do. So HC said, how much salary are you comfortable with leaving? Basically, like as much as it. I don't even look at it. A lot of times for baseball, I set this to 0. Right? I set this equal to 0 pretty often for baseball. There's often times where like 2 relatively cheaper pitchers and 2 cheap stacks can be a pretty good lineup. And I like to get those. So because every lineup is based on a set of simulations, right? You will never get a terrible lineup that has no win equity with your min salaries at 0. So I just turn it to 0 just because I want to allow some of those unique low salary builds to show up. So T said, how would you use SaberSim to find the top stacks of a slate? Thanks. Yeah, so this is a really good practical application of those 0-0-10 builds that we were just talking about, right? So how would you use SaberSim to find the top overall stacks on the slate? What I like to do is I like to use the simulations directly. So I will come over here, I will go into the build settings, and I will say, build me a build where I am getting a single slate simulation, right? They're only going to play the games once. So I'm going to use a single game simulation, single slate simulation. In this case, I'm going to turn min salary off because I don't want that to be restrictive. I'm going to do this 1,500 times, which is the maximum number of sims you can do on the advanced plan, right? But I want to research stacks. So I basically want to say, show me what is the most optimal 5 stack to use after 1,500 random slate simulations where we don't count correlation and ownership fade in any other way, right? And you can build this, and I don't know, we'll see how quickly this builds. I may or may not let this build all the way, but you can build this and then study your team stack exposures on step 3, and it will work as a way of approximating what stacks are most likely to be viable. Okay, this is building pretty fast, so we'll actually show this. Because we are taking actually, let me put it this way. You can basically use this as a tool to say, if a 5 stack is optimal, or if a 5 stack is a winning lineup, you can essentially use the exposure that you're getting here in this build as a way to approximate the percent chance that that team is the responsible 5 stack, right? So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that one of the core assumptions that we've baked into this here is that a 5 stack is optimal, right? That's not necessarily true. We've basically we've put that limitation on the builder, and we've forced the builder to cooperate with that. And you could use smaller stacks if you want. I've mostly just done with 5 stacks, but it's a very, very cool way of taking advantage of the simulations that we have and studying the slate from a stack standpoint, right? And you can see, right, on a 7-game slate like tonight, there's a lot of diversity here. In fact, I'd actually recommend switching over to the 5 stacks just to force it that way, right? So right now, according to where the Sims stand, Atlanta is the best 5 stack, but they only have a 10% chance of being the best overall team. And the drop from Atlanta to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the 8th best stack on the slate is only like 2.5%. So this is where it gets fun, right? And actually, Matt, if you're watching, this would be a good opportunity to say, this is actually very reminiscent of what I actually end up doing with my process. I take advantage of these research builds pretty heavily, and I look for opportunities where I think the field is going to be inefficient with their ownership, right? There's a 2.5, according to our sims, that Atlanta is the most likely to be the best stack on the slate, but they're only 2.5% more likely than the Mets, who are the 8th best option, and all of these teams are in between. This is where then I would start incorporating some research into ownership, either looking at Vegas or just the ownership projections, and ask, is there an inefficiency here, right? Let's look at this, actually. Let's go to Vegas, because I just find I think this is fun. And I like this Fantasy Labs Vegas dashboard as kind of a quick way when it's working to see the implied totals for each team on the slate, but maybe this isn't working so good. Let's see, do a refresh here. No, not working great. So anyway, basically, like let's say you had some reason to believe that San Francisco is going to be lower owned than these other teams, right? Well, maybe that's a good opportunity of a team to play. So, all right. Ryan said I set ownership fade to 0 for Boston/New York Showdown last night. The relief pitcher exposure looked a lot more normal. Yeah, I expect it would. So, David said, how do I get meaningfully different than other SaberSim users? So, because of the way that we use the simulations when you're building lineups, this is actually pretty well automated for you. I would actually not spend your time worrying about avoiding duplication with other SaberSim users. And let me explain what I mean. So the sim variance slider, right? So this is controlling how your sims are bucketed for each individual lineup. So at a sim variance of high, for example, for tonight's slate, you're going to take a relatively small bucket of sims of each game from the ocean of 10,000 simulations of each game on the slate, and every lineup is optimized for that set of sims. It actually makes it exceedingly difficult, even at low sim variance settings, to duplicate yourself or to duplicate another SaberSim user. And you can actually test this. If you were to go in here and remove the rules, I'm not going to do this, but run a build. Look at your top 20, maybe even your top 1, and then run another build, and then run another build, and you will see it is extremely, extremely hard to duplicate another SaberSim user on extremely hard to duplicate another SaberSim user using default settings alone, because that sim variance bucketing is making you so naturally diverse, right? It's actually, it's pretty cool. In general, I think an optimizer that dupes itself, that like builds the same lineup every single time, that optimizer is implying that the expected value of that top lineup is way higher than it is, right? The fact that you get a different lineup at the top every single time you run a build on step 2 or on step 3, I guess, is a feature. It says that SaberSim understands the natural variance of the game, and it understands that the best lineups to play for a given slate all are very close together in expected value. With that said, if you are overall interested in diversifying from SaberSim, right? I guess the point I should make here first quickly is that the only worry that you really should have here is duplication, right? Like SaberSim users do not occupy a large enough portion of the player base of DFS that they move the needle from an ownership standpoint alone. Your only concern for how to get meaningfully different from other SaberSim users would be from the standpoint of duplication, right? So that essentially handles that. I would be more concerned otherwise from getting meaningfully different from the field than from other SaberSim users. And the ownership fade slider will mostly help with that. This will basically say, ownership's important. Think about ownership. With 2 players with the exact same projection for a set of sims, give me the one that is lower owned, right? All of that to say, let's just say, just because you want to play in a more different way, you want to be diversified against other SaberSim users, what should you do? What I would do, especially for baseball, because as we just saw, right, virtually every stack has a chance to be optimal in tonight's slate. What I would do is, when you build your test build with SaberSim, you are going to get an angle, right? The builder is basically going to look at the simulations. It's going to look at the slate. It's going to look at the contests that you're playing and the ownership projections and kind of make a stand, right? So if we actually were to build these, you'll see it's not just going to jam the chalk. It's going to basically decide for itself where the inefficient ownership is and what the best way to handle that particular situation is. But really, for baseball in particular, it is just one of many, because there are so many different opportunities of the way that the slate could play out. If you want to meaningfully diversify from other SaberSim users, not to avoid duplication, but just to play differently, I would run a research build. I would run your 0-0-10 build with a stacking rule set or without one, and study Vegas lines. Let's see if this is up. I wish it was. There it is. Study the implied team totals for each team on the slate and see if you can determine for yourself where the inefficient ownership is, right? See if you can make that decision for yourself. And then actually, adjust your lineups in step 3 according to that. Right? Let's see what we get out of this build real quick, and we'll see. But you'll see it here shortly, right? I wouldn't be surprised. It may be the Giants, because that was a team it'll be one of those teams that was popping in our research build where the ownership is going to be higher. Could be the Yankees or the Blue Jays too, but let's see. Let's see. Give this just a second to load. Okay. So it's the Mets, it's the Blue Jays, it's the Phillies, right? So the Mets are actually probably the perfect example. Let's go back to our research build. Was it this one? Hang on. It's a little slow bouncing in between builds here, so I apologize. Especially on my computer. I'm starting to become kind of due for a computer purchase, which this thing is showing its age for sure. Okay, so right. So what did we just learn? Remember when we were looking at this? We were like, basically, we had sims. Wait. Oh, this is a different stack. Okay, so 4 or 5 stacks, right? We basically determined that the percent chance of any of these top teams are pretty close, but the ownership is going to be very different here, right? So basically, the SaberSim, according to our test builds, for a 20 max, 10 to 50K, is basically saying like the best way to leverage that is to play Toronto and the Mets, and I can't remember what the other team was all of a sudden. But it was basically coming up with an angle here. You could pick a different angle. That's totally fine. You could come to your own approach and look at this and say, well, okay, so let's see. It's Braves. Wait. It's Braves. It's Rays. It's Angels. Maybe you decide you want to be overweight on Seattle, right? Because where's Seattle, right? All the way down here. Projected for 4.3 by Vegas. We think it is the 9% most likely, or the 4th most likely team to be the optimal 5 stack, right? That would be, and you can then come over here to your test build and say, no, I don't really want to play these other stacks that the builder came up with. I'm going to play these Seattle stacks that I researched on my own. And it would probably be equally as valid. So like here, now we can come over here and say, let's go to stacks or teams. And where's Seattle? So we don't even have any Seattle right now. Let's say I want 50%. Boom. Well, I early boom. Preemptive boom. Boom. 50% Seattle stacks. Right? What's the other one? What was the other one that was popping here? San Francisco was the very first one I said, right? Where's San Francisco? I want 50% San Francisco. Forget it. I want 50% San Francisco. I want those to be my 2 biggest stacks. 50% each. Right? Done. Now let's go in and how do our stack types look, right? Kind of putting all the pieces together. And maybe I don't want to play any 4-2-2s, right? 5-3s, 5-2s, 4-4s, 4-3s. Those are the ones I want. Done. Right? Now I want, okay, now let's manage our risk a little bit. I have 60% exposure to pitchers. That actually looks pretty good. So maybe I'll just ride with this. This all actually looks pretty good. Oh, this is the build I set max exposure to 60. So that works, I guess. But so now I've got something going here, right? I ran a build. I've capped my exposure appropriately. I've added some value with my own research build. I think San Francisco and Seattle stacks are going to be unowned or lower owned than they should be. And I'm feeling good, right? So, Aaron said, what's the math I can use for spreading out team stacks into 20 max? I'm bad at math. I don't know if it's a math problem, right? It's for 20 max. I mean, here's a decent way to do this, right? So we just saw, right? We just ran a research build and we saw that like the most likely team to be the optimal stack has a 10% chance, right? And then the lowest likely team to be the optimal team has like a 2% chance, right? Your spread of actual probabilities there is like 2 to 10%. So while keeping in mind you only have 20 lineups to work with, right? 5% exposure to a stack is only one lineup. you should frame your reference from there, right? Like, so if I'm 50% on San Francisco and Seattle, I'm basically like, I have 5 times more exposure to these stacks as their likelihood of being the optimal stack on the slate is. And I think that will allow you to kind of frame how much exposure you're comfortable with here. But there isn't, again, it's not, I mean, to be honest, there probably is some math that you could do and calculate like the optimal amount of exposure to have to these different teams, right? There are definitely some people out there doing that, but that's not how I always think about it, right? I'm not that granular. I do this in a more intuitive way, but like if you're unsure of what these numbers should be for yourself, run that research build and set a stacking rule and look how often are certain teams showing up as the optimal stack. And that will at least arm you with the probabilities of these outcomes. But I won't be able to say exactly, you should have 15% exposure to this stack or 20% to this stack or whatever. So CG says, when you make those percent edits, the lineups change. And when you download those new lineups are in your 20 or 150, correct? Yes, they do. So very unique to SaberSim, what we do here. So when I built these lineups, this is hypothetically for a 20 max. So I only need 20 lineups, but we built a pool of 500. And the reason for that is twofold. I've talked about both reasons today already. The first is that we are more equipped to determine what the best lineups are out of that pool of, or we can be more confident in saying these are the best 20 you can say when you're picking the 20 out of the pool of 500, as opposed to just being the first 20 you built, right? No optimizer, no tool is perfect. So you give yourself, 25 times more opportunities at getting every lineup right. Or wait, 5 times 20. I don't even know. Stream's getting long here, right? You're giving yourself more opportunities to build every lineup and make sure it's the best one you could have played when you build a big pool. But it also lets you dynamically make decisions like this. Like I can build this pool of 500 lineups where I got no Giants and no Mariners stacks in my 20, but I decided based on my own research that I wanted those 2 stacks because I think they're going to be under-owned, and I went in and set a minimum exposure. And then what happens here is we actually use that pool to we use this pool to pull in lineups for our 20. So basically what it's doing is it is going through the pool of 500 lineups to find the best 20 where every exposure setting is met. So in this case, it needs to have 50% Giant stacks, 50% Seattle stacks, and then I think we also went in here and said no 4-2-2 stacks. So then we get 5 3s, 4 4s, 5 2s, 5 4 3s, where my exposures are met. And I could continue to go from here, right? Let's go to the pitchers. And maybe, let's see, is there a pitcher that I'm like overexposed to? Maybe I don't want to play this much Chris Flexen, right? Maybe I just don't even want to play Flexen at all. I can come in here and hit 0. And then it'll go through again and kind of re-update. It'll find the best 20 in the pool of 500 where the exposures are met. Eventually, of course, we could run out of lineups. There could be no 20 of the pool of 500 where all those exposures are met. If that happens, you'll get a message on the screen that says as much. Typically, if that's the case, your best option is to go back to step 1 and instead adjust projections of certain players or set minimum and maximum exposures before the build to build you a better pool of lineups that should work for what you're trying to do. But in general, you can get a lot done on step 3. So, okay, so I'm going to hit this will be the last question I answer for today. I want to come back to this. This is from Matt, and I've hinted at this now throughout the stream. But I want to talk a little bit about what I do here. So he said, can you explain some of your top ways that you go about finding your leverage, value, fades, above the field plays, etc., looking to find some ways to use the SaberSim optimizer to find areas to attack, things like individual players and certain lineup structures. So here is, in a very basic sense, kind of what my process looks like to begin this season. I am starting everything with a research build. right? So when I sit down to build my lineups for the slate, I come in here, and what I do is I run a build that looks like this, right? We've talked about this a bunch on stream today. We talk about this a lot on every stream, right? This will take every game on the slate, single simulation, and build it all together. Or it's not a very good way to say that. This will take a single slate simulation and build the optimal lineup for that slate sim, right? I have not been setting a stacking rule when I do my research build lately. I may go back to that, but for now I'm not. I'm looking at individual players primarily, and I will run this. And I'm looking at how often a player shows up in the optimal lineup compared to their ownership as a general way to get a sense of how I want to leverage the field. What I am actually doing here, what I've actually been doing is I have been taking this information and putting it into Excel and basically making a decision on how I'm tackling every single player on the slate based on their ownership. But for the purposes of kind of explaining my thinking, essentially I look at, what is the percentage of how often a player shows up in the optimal lineup versus how often they're going to be owned, and how does that adjust whether I want to be over or under the field? How do I want to tackle that particular player? So for a player, we'll see this in a second when we get this pulled up, but so one sec. So let's look at pitchers first. Okay. So I will compare the projected ownership to the exposure, right? So right now at the moment, I feel like the most efficient pitcher to fade, right? The best overall pitcher to be under the field on this particular slate is Alex Wood, who is owned 31% of the time and is only optimal 21% of the time, right? The best overall pitcher to be over the field on is probably Alek Manoah, right? You need to have some intuition here, right? Josh Rogers is technically a better play because he is, 3.9% more likely to be optimal than his ownership, but he's not very likely to be optimal, period. Right? Alek Manoah is probably my favorite pitching play on the slate. And I essentially ultimately will take all of this and put it into Excel and kind of make a decision on each individual player that I end up re-uploading as a custom projection in step one. But that is kind of strategically how I approach every slate from the start, is I'm running a research build to determine how likely is a player to be optimal versus their ownership, and determining if ownership is efficient or inefficient on the player. So that should be kind of like at least a quick introduction of the way I think about it. So everything kind of follows from there. My leverage, I don't do so much research beyond this in terms of determining how I want to tackle the slate. And then Matt said, is there a way to reduce my starting pitcher combo risk? I find that when I first exposure to certain stacks, it gives me the same combo with that stack. Interesting. Let's see. So at the moment, there is not literally a very good way to go about doing this. Literally meaning one thing we want to add in the future is to go in and filter and say filter, show me all of my lineups that have this pitcher and this stack, and then reduce the exposure of that combination or something like that. There's not a super good way to do that without being very extreme at the moment. I'm trying to think about if there's a good workaround way to do that. Right? Let's see. Let's look at. If you wanted to reduce your exposure to Manoah and Wood together. I don't know. I don't know if I have a great answer for how I would go about doing that. Reducing combinations of exposures. It's something that typically I don't worry about too much. I think I think you could reduce your exposure to those two players, period. I think that would be a decent starting point of like just capping your risk to those two players together. I also think you could playing with a higher sim variance setting or potentially increasing your min uniques as a way to diversify. But longer term, we do want to add a feature that will allow you to basically say, you know, cap my exposure to Alex Wood in Manoah lineups or something like that. There's just not a super good way to do that right now. So I apologize about that, but okay. That's it. That'll be the stream for today. Thanks everybody for tuning in, asking questions. That was a fun one. I enjoyed that. Hopefully you guys did too. We talked about a lot of stuff: correlation, exposures, risk management, research builds, late swap. What else? Showdowns, all kinds of different stuff. It was a fun one. Good way to start the week. Good luck in your contest tonight. If you're playing the main slate tonight, if your early slate entries are live right now, like mine are, hope things are going well for you there. I will be right back here again tomorrow, same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern for another stream. Before that stream, hopefully, very likely before that stream, I will be putting out a video to our YouTube channel about contest selection in baseball DFS for this season. Our principles of contest selection, but also going through the DraftKings and FanDuel lobby and talking about what my favorite contests to play are for different bankroll requirements or different bankroll goals or anything like that. So look forward to that. And otherwise, we'll be right back here tomorrow for the stream. So until then, good luck tonight and see you tomorrow. See ya.